to maybe take it back to your own childhood. One thing you and I have in common, we both were immigrants to the United States as young boys in 1976 for different reasons. But before we get to the heart of your book, obviously a long career in Republican politics, advisor to multiple presidential campaigns. Even though it was before Reagan came into office, can you talk about maybe the impact upon your childhood and adolescence and being a teenager growing up in the United States of the Reagan years, especially in light of the fact that his push for human rights, his push for pushing back in the Soviet Union is, even if it's a bit afterwards, is it related to your own story? Can you maybe let people know your own family story?
Well, I mean, growing up in the, whoops, I guess I gotta turn this thing on, right? Let's see, does this actually work? Okay, can you hear me now? All right. I mean, growing up in the 1980s, was like a lot of young folks at that time, Reagan kind of made conservatism cool, and all the more so for me, coming from that, Soviet emigre background, and Soviet immigrants are kind of like Cuban immigrants. They tend to be pretty right-wing, and so that's kind of naturally where I gravitated in U.S. politics, and thrilled to Reagan, calling out the evil empire, saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and all the rest of it. And it's been kind of a long, steady, multi-decade process of disillusionment. But I think that, I think the fact that I'm not a Republican anymore, I'm an independent now, I think has actually been beneficial for writing this book, because that's something that allowed me to have the necessary distance and objectivity to look at Reagan as both a successful president, but also as a flawed individual, and to see both the positive and the negative, and there was plenty of both. And so that, I think if I had still been kind of in my ardent Reagan fanboy stage from when I was 15 years old, this would not be a great book. I really set out to write with a degree of objectivity and balance that I don't think we have seen in previous accounts of Reagan. As I write in the foreword, trying to produce neither a hagiography nor a hit job, but really trying to produce the first definitive biography. And I was thrilled to see on Monday when the New Yorker released their review, and they actually said, Boot aspires to write the definitive biography, and he has succeeded. Well, that means a lot to me, because that is what I've been trying to do for the last decade.
And I will concur, and it was an incredibly huge project that you worked on it for about 11 years. A lot of people might know you for your other excellent books. Pulitzer Prize finalist for The Road Not Taken, incredible book about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And I do think this book, to me, I've read other biographies, lots of articles. This is, to me, will be, moving forward, the definitive biography of Reagan. It's very balanced, it's very contextualized, and it's comprehensive. It covers all of his life, so we're talking about the better part of almost a century of American history. We won't have time to cover all of it, maybe the highlights of it, and then I'd like to kind of focus on American foreign policy under Reagan. Sure. But maybe just to start, one thing that's unique about him compared to any other American president is basically almost 40 years before he ever ran for president, well, the first time in 76, he was on the American stage. People knew him from his movies. They knew him especially from his TV shows. Can you talk about how it was that there was a persona of extremely likable, extremely optimistic, extremely affable person in the Reagan himself that the American public got to know, but for the people actually closest to him, the great enigma was they felt he was someone very hard to be close to, maybe the exception of Nancy, that he was someone who was hard to really know where he stood and where he was, but great patriot for the American people, but one-on-one as a friend, it might be a challenge. How did those kind of years shape him before he ever got to run into office for president?
Well, Ronald Reagan was the first, but not the last, host of a nationally televised show to become president. And so the fact that he was the host of General Electric Theater actually had a lot to do with his success as a politician, because he was beamed into everybody's living room in the 1950s, and it was one of the top-rated shows in the land. I would add that in addition to his duties as the host of General Electric Theater, every Sunday night on CBS, he was also a spokesman for GE, and that was really an introduction to him on how to speak on his feet, how to address political issues. that was when he began his pattern of writing down facts and arguments on index cards, and he would shuffle the index cards before giving a speech, and then, you know, the ones that worked he would keep, the ones that didn't work he would throw them out, and so he would really hone his speech to a very high level of rhetorical effectiveness, going from, you know, GE plant to GE plant and corporate offices and elsewhere. So, and that was, you know, that was really where the nation was introduced to Reagan, and he became, you know, like so many people who are on TV, it feels like they're sitting next to you. It feels like they're part of your family, and certainly, you know, an entire generation grew up with Reagan in their living rooms. And that really showcased his very genial, amiable personality. There was a reporter in the mid-'60s who covered him who said that the Reagan personality was like soothing bathwater. He was, you know, he made you feel good, even when what he was selling was a very hard-edged message, a very hard-edged right-wing message, but he sold it in a much more winning and effective manner than Barry Goldwater did, for example, in 1964. Now, you know, the Reagan who was beamed into people's living rooms, kind of the genial, wisecracking, amiable American everyman, also the same character who became governor and president. It wasn't a fiction, that was true, but it wasn't like the whole of his personality. And in fact, as Ronan was suggesting, as I write about in the book, you know, people who actually knew Reagan basically concluded they didn't really know Reagan, that he was actually, people who were, you know, worked for him very closely, concluded that he was actually fairly icy and detached at his core. As Jim Baker said to me, you know, you could never forget with him that you were a hired hand, and, you know, he could find you useful one day and you would be gone the next, and he'd never remember that you were there. So he was actually fairly detached in his relationships with most people, aside from Nancy, you know, and he became obviously very dependent on Nancy. But even Nancy said that there was some part of him that was closed off even from her. And I traced that in the book to his itinerant, very difficult childhood, growing up in small town, early 20th century Illinois, with a father who was an alcoholic shoe salesman, kept losing one job after another, so the family kept moving from town to town, and so he never really stuck around long enough to become close to any of the other kids. And so he kind of followed his own path, and, you know, he would be sitting up in the attic reading books, or, you know, dreaming about the world. And so he was, you know, the image he projected was that he was a very gregarious, amiable person, which in some ways he was. But one of the people that I talked to who knew him best, and one of my best sources, Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant dating back to 1966, and Stu is, by the way, still alive and well and living near Palm Springs in his 90s. But Stu said to me, you know, Reagan would have made a pretty good hermit because he didn't really need anybody aside from maybe Nancy. I mean, he wasn't a guy who wanted to go out and socialize. And his idea of a great night would be to put on his PJs, get in front of the TV, eat dinner, watch Bonanza or Gunsmoke, read a little bit, and then go to bed. He wasn't like out there glad-handing. He wasn't really an extrovert. He was actually fairly introverted, and it was really Nancy who pushed him out the door and got him to socialize. But so, and what I found in doing the book was that his jokes and his stories, the way that he related to people, it was always on a very superficial level, and it was really designed to keep people at a distance, that he would like trade quips with you, but he wouldn't really find out what was going on in your life. And that was true even with his kids. I mean, he had no idea what was going on with his kids' lives. I mean, for example, you know, Michael was molested as a youngster, and Reagan didn't find this out until the 1980s when Michael revealed it in a memoir. So there was all these things going on that he had no idea about, but he nevertheless, you know, projected that very amiable, very friendly and winning personality to great effect.
You know, obviously you portray it very well in the book. There's no day X or day Y when this starts or transition occurs. Reagan and his father in particular is a FDR, New Dealer Democrat, kind of a minority in rural Illinois at the time, conservative part of the country. He's very proud of what FDR has done. He's kind of idolizes him. He says, Reagan's own words, "I was a very emotional New Dealer." Can you discuss how that kind of gradual change occurred for Reagan to go from being such an advocate and believer in FDR, and especially the idea of big government helping people, especially when they're dire need, to where he came to. And how do you think that occurred? Why did it occur?
Yeah, I mean, the New Deal really saved his family, saved his father, Jack Reagan, who got a job as working on a New Deal program and after he was unemployed in the 1930s. And so that kind of cemented young Dutch Reagan's attachment to FDR. And you raise a very important and really central issue in Reagan's life. How did he go from Democrat to Republican? And the way he told it is not accurate, because the way he always related it was, his one-liner was, I didn't desert my party deserted me. And that might have been accurate if he had become a Democrat like in 1972, and if he had become a Republican rather in 1972, and he could say, oh, I can't stand George McGovern, these damn hippies, they're going too far to the left. But he didn't become a Republican in 1972. He became a Republican in the 50s, and certainly by 1960, at a time when the Democratic Party was pretty darn conservative. I mean, who were the two dominant Democrats in the nation in the 1950s? It was Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn. In 1960, Jack Kennedy ran to Nixon's right on defense policy. So the notion that the Democrats were some kind of, commie appeasers or sympathizers, that just was not accurate. It was actually a pretty conservative party. So the change was really Reagan. It wasn't the change in the Democratic Party. And if you look at how this transition happened, I trace it in the book. It begins in World War II, when as a very highly paid movie actor, he did not enjoy paying like 90% rate of income tax. But it really accelerated after the war. Immediately after the war, he was kind of a starry-eyed, one-worlder, liberal, calling for nuclear disarmament and getting involved in kind of progressive political causes in Hollywood. But then he rapidly segued into being a very staunch anti-communist, involved in administering the blacklist in Hollywood. And that was as part of his role as a union leader, as the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was convinced by the FBI and by anti-communists like Luella Parsons, the gossip columnist, and others, that there was this communist plot to take over Hollywood that he had to resist. And this was largely, again, I researched this, and I think this was largely imaginary, that there were communists in Hollywood, but there was not like a Maid in the Kremlin plot to take over Hollywood. But he imagined that there was, and he thought that he was resisting it and saving Hollywood. And so that made him a very ardent anti-communist. But then his conversion to free market economics and the rest of the conservative belief system really occurred in the 1950s when he was working for GE, because at the time, GE was a very conservative company. In fact, their outlook was likened by one of their executives to that of the John Birch Society. And for GE, this was actually, they saw this as a good business sense, because they were petrified about unions and strikes, and they thought the way to inoculate themselves from unions was to spread laissez-faire ideology. And so they basically force-fed these right-wing pamphlets and magazines and often very conspiratorial tracts on their executives and managers and others. And so Reagan, representing GE, would have a lot of time to read, because he would take the train from LA to New York. He was afraid of flying in those days. So he had a long time to sit there on the train and read all this right-wing literature that GE was telling him to read. And then he would not only read it, he would internalize it and go out and give speeches espousing a lot of its tenets. So that was really the process by which, by the early 1960s, this one-time New Dealer who had idolized FDR, was the head of Democrats for Nixon, and then became a Republican, and then made his national political debut in 1964 with his Time for Choosing speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater, which, if you actually listen to it, you can see it on YouTube, or if you read it, it was actually a very right-wing speech in which he actually said that the Democratic Party of Jefferson, Jackson, and Cleveland was now being led under the banners of Lenin, Marx, and Stalin. So that was what he was accusing his former party of doing by that point, of basically trying to turn America socialist or even communist. So that was a huge transformation in the space of about 15 years.
Another, I think, impressive thing about his Hollywood years is, for a short period, he was an extremely well-paid actor, be a millionaire in today's times. A lot of actors might have gotten into the party scene or gotten extremely arrogant and full of themselves. Even though he had his high degree of confidence in himself, he always knew, I'm not just running for state rep, I'm going to run for governor. I'm not just going to run for senator, I'm going to run for president, years ahead of time. But he also had an incredible degree of humility and just kind of common decency that he always kept, as a true gentleman, which is perhaps missing, sadly, from today's politics. One of the history notes, it is you highlight his diaries a lot. Even in his diary, maybe he knew it would be read by others later. He wouldn't even spell out a curse word. Hell wouldn't even be spelled out. He'd leave
Right.
letters.
Yeah.
How is it that his politics changed, but I mean, maybe most importantly, his core persona did not in Hollywood, in a time when so many others might have?
Well, again, this is what Stu Spencer said to me, is that he was always true to this Midwestern ethos, and as this small town boy growing up in the rural Midwest in the early 20th century. I mean, that was before Disneyland had a Main Street USA ride. He grew up on the actual Main Street USA, and that was good and bad. I mean, there were certainly negative aspects of it. I mean, he was often very oblivious to what his African American neighbors were experiencing, for example, at a time when there was segregation in Illinois, and the Ku Klux Klan was very active in his hometown of Dixon in the 1920s, and he seemed oblivious to that. But there was also a decency and a kind of a down-to-earth quality to him that I think he learned in these small towns and taught by his parents. And obviously, he came from the wrong side of the tracks, even though he tried to. He tried to gussy up his childhood, but it was basically a very difficult, itinerant, impoverished childhood, and he always, that always kept him grounded. He never became too full of himself, never let his ego get out of control, because he still remembered what it was like, when he graduated from college, Eureka College in 1932, in the midst of the Great Depression, and it was by no means certain that he would find a job. So many people didn't have work at that point, and he actually was miraculously lucky and very good, and wound up, becoming a sportscaster in Davenport, Iowa, and then in Des Moines, and then making his way to Hollywood and so forth. But he still remembered what it was like to grow up very impoverished, and he never became too full of himself. And I think there was an anecdote that I relate from after he left the presidency, like in 1989, 1990, or I guess it was 1989, when his staff got an office for him in Century City, and he showed up there before everything was fully ready, because he was so eager to get to work doing whatever he was going to do there. And then, at the end of the first day, he came out and saw Fred Ryan, who was then his chief of staff, and said, "Fred, this is a list of people that I'd like to talk to." And Fred looked at the list and said, "Well, gosh, Mr. President, I don't recognize any of these names. Who are these people?" And it turned out what had happened was the phone system was not wired up correctly. So calls from the general public were not going to Reagan's secretary. They were going straight to Reagan. And people would call up and say, "I'd like to speak to Ronald Reagan." And he would say, "Yes." And they would say they wanted to see him. And he'd say, "Well, sure, come on by." And that was, he wasn't like, you could imagine some other ex-president screaming at his staff to get rid of the calls and make these people go away, but that wasn't Ronald Reagan. He was like happy to talk to people, happy to see them. He was very, very accommodating, and this was after, he'd been the leader of the free world. So that kind of tells you that he never, the small town boy, was never entirely erased, even as he became this historical figure.
You mentioned that increasingly, in terms of, to get people's attention or become popular, he might have taken publicly more extreme, ardent views to the right. But you mentioned, Jim Baker. A lot of people say nobody knows Washington for those years better than him. Arguably the best chief of staff ever. Definitely maybe the best Secretary of State in the last, since World War II. Quote Baker about Reagan is, he was a true conservative, but boy, was he pragmatic when it came to governing. You mentioned how that's true when he's governor, despite wanting to keep budgets down. The California budget goes up by like 140%, 120%. Same with when he's president, goes up by about 70%. Can you explain his pragmatism and really his kind of wise recognition that to get something done, you're going to have to compromise?
Yeah, well, this is really the central paradox of Ronald Reagan. He could be very ideological, very right-wing as a campaigner, as a public speaker, but once in office, he had a way of pivoting towards the center and making deals with Democrats in both Sacramento and Washington, and he had nothing but contempt for conservatives to go over the cliff with their flags flying. That's a quote from Ronald Reagan. And he often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want today and come back for more tomorrow rather than, insist on 100% and get nothing. So that was, again, I think that was a reflection of that very practical Midwestern ethos that he grew up with. And, the very fact that he chose Jim Baker as his White House chief of staff was a reflection of how pragmatic he was, because we kind of take it for granted now, but in fact it was a very unusual choice, because Jim Baker at that point did not know Reagan well, and he had in fact worked against Reagan twice, in 76 for Ford and 80 for Bush, to try to deny Reagan the Republican nomination. And presidents don't normally appoint their rival's campaign manager as their White House chief of staff. Normally they appoint one of their own cronies. And in fact, there was a widespread assumption that Ed Meese was going to be appointed White House chief of staff because he'd had that job in Sacramento. But Stu Spencer and Mike Deaver and Nancy Reagan basically figured that Ed Meese was too disorganized. He didn't know Washington. He wasn't going to get things done. And they convinced Reagan to appoint Jim Baker instead, who was this kind of pragmatist and wheeler dealer from Houston. Didn't have a close personal relationship with the Reagans, but he turned into, as Ronan said, perhaps the most effective White House chief of staff in history, and that really accounted for why Reagan was so successful in his first term. Very important, very pragmatic decision.
And turning to when he does get into office, he inherits a ship. The country is not just on fire, but the ship is sinking too. He's got a lot of things going wrong. Maybe two things he's best known for in the first few years is kind of bringing back a sense of pride for the American people after Vietnam, after Watergate, after really distrust of both a Democratic president, LBJ, and a Republican president in Nixon, a host of economic problems. Can you discuss kind of maybe that harder to define issue of bringing back American confidence, and then maybe the harder issue of how he tackled the economic difficulties that were put in front of him?
Well, I think that was truly his strong suit, as you would expect from somebody who had been an actor and a TV host. And also somebody who idolized FDR and in many ways emulated FDR. He was a tremendous communicator, and he had great confidence in the future, great optimism about the United States, always spoke about America as a shining city on a hill. And that was something that I think a lot of people wanted to hear after all the turmoil and trouble of the 1970s. So I think he helped to restore the nation's morale, certainly restored the military's morale in the 1980s, and I think that is one of his most important achievements. In terms of actually turning the economy around, I would argue, in fact I do argue in the book, that more important than Reagan was actually probably Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed, because it was Volcker who hiked interest rates, which caused the very steep recession in 81, 82, but also wrung the inflation out of the economy. And once the inflation rate came down, the business cycle could work its magic. And so by 1984, the economy was rebounding very strongly with 7% growth. That was kind of a fluke that had happened in that re-election year, but it did, and that's what accounted for Reagan's ability to win 49 of 50 states. But although I think Volcker deserves the bulk of the credit for the economic turnaround, I think Reagan also deserves some credit for supporting Volcker, because a lot of his aides, including Don Regan and others, thought that he should have pressured Volcker to prematurely lower interest rates, which if he had done that, could have been disastrous. It could have meant that inflation continued to linger. And he was willing to take the hard medicine of the anti-inflationary policy that the Fed was pursuing. And all those things combined to bring the economy back certainly by 1984.
And related to the economy, as you discuss well in the book, Volcker probably deserves the most credit, but he does deserve credit for perhaps recognizing maybe errors that have made, what needs to be changed. The first few years, supply side economics, you hear Reaganomics, his own vice president called it voodoo economics, this trickle down theory. But eventually he realizes I must do something importantly, and he raises taxes actually more times in his administration than he lowers them. Can you talk about maybe coming to those pragmatic realities, and how did he convince the Republicans in his own party and Republican voters that this is okay to do it?
Well, remember, this was a very different Republican Party. In fact, both parties were very different, because in the 1980s, you still had conservative and liberal factions in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And so, to pass the Reagan economic agenda required the votes of a lot of Democrats, the so-called boll weevil conservative Democrats. And there were a lot of conservative Democrats, whereas there were liberal Republicans who were not on board. So it was a very different political landscape from the one that we see today. But there was no question that Reagan was very passionately attached to tax cuts. He wanted to cut especially personal income taxes, and he achieved that in 1981. But then his tax cut bill got larded up with all sorts of other tax cuts for businesses and special interests and all sorts of things that happened in the tug and pull of lobbying in Congress. And the result was that the deficit was skyrocketing by 1982. And so Reagan was convinced by Jim Baker and Howard Baker on the Hill and Bob Dole and others to support a bill that raised or took back some of the business tax cuts, left the personal tax cuts alone, but reversed some of the huge cuts in business taxes. And he kind of rationalized it. Reagan kind of rationalized it by saying that he wasn't really raising taxes. It was just revenue adjustments. But it was actually a substantial tax increase, and not the only one that he passed as president. So, and a lot of Republicans were not happy with that. But Reagan was convinced that it was necessary to do it. He supported it. He did it. I mean, that's another example of his fundamentally pragmatic approach to governance.
And I would say perhaps, definitely in terms of foreign policy, but maybe in terms of his overall complete presidential legacy, a lot of people would say his role, directly or indirectly, with the kind of slow collapse of the Soviet Union. You very correctly point out in the book that most of that credit really should go to Gorbachev. Those ideas for perestroika and glasnost came internally, were happening in Russia, and maybe actually were stunted with excessive pressure from the United States. But can you first discuss, I suppose, how it was that Reagan's perception of the Soviet Union changed, especially with regards to Gorbachev, when he felt before there's no way he could trust anybody?
Well, one of the most persistent myths about Reagan is that he had this secret plan to bring down the evil empire, and that he plotted to bring down the Soviet Union. And the fact that the Soviet Union did collapse in 1991, a few years after he left office, lends a surface plausibility to that. And so there have been a lot of Reagan supporters who have written books and articles along those lines. I actually asked this question of George Shultz, his Secretary of State. I said, did you have this secret plan to bring down the Soviet Union? And he said, no, we did not. What we had was a general peace through strength attitude, but we certainly weren't trying to, we didn't have any kind of blueprint to win the Cold War. And in fact, Reagan's foreign policy was less consistent the closer you look at it. It's only like if you apply this 10,000 feet view to it that it seems like everything worked out just as he planned. In reality, he pursued conciliatory and confrontational measures side by side, and often not as part of some grand plan, but just kind of willy-nilly. And people talk, a lot of people say, his defense buildup bankrupted the Soviet Union, all these other measures he took to undermine the Soviet economy. Well, there was some of that, but there was also, in 1981, he also lifted the grain embargo that Carter had imposed after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And after the imposition of martial law in 1982, he briefly imposed sanctions on the Siberian natural gas pipeline to Europe, and then he lifted those sanctions because our European allies didn't like it. So he was kind of all over the place. And his first term foreign policy of the Soviet Union was not very successful. And as he himself admitted, I mean, he said, I wanted to meet with a Soviet leader, but they kept dying on me. So he couldn't get very far. And he only achieved real success in dealing with the Soviet Union after 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. And Gorbachev was really a black swan. He was somebody who rose to the top of this dictatorial system, but lost faith in the dictatorship and really Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War. He wanted to end the arms race. He wanted to reduce defense spending so that the government could spend more money on ordinary Soviet citizens. And he was not forced to do all this by Ronald Reagan. This was by his own moral compass. But I think what Reagan does deserve credit for, and which he doesn't get enough credit for, is recognizing that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader and somebody that he could do business with, which he began to see after meeting Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985. And there were still a lot of skeptics at that time, including his own defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, who thought that Reagan was being snookered by this wily communist who wanted us to drop our guard. But Reagan understood that no, this was actually somebody that Gorbachev was well-intentioned and was actually trying to make real reforms, and that it was in America's interest to support him. And that's again one of these surprising turns in Reagan's life story, which is full of these unexpected turns. The fact that this guy who was such an ardent anti-communist throughout his political career, who began his life in the public in the 1940s as a red hunter and blacklister in Hollywood, that he wound up by his second term as president working so closely with the #1 communist in the world, Gorbachev, to peacefully end the Cold War. That was a staggering achievement, but it's different from the way that it's often portrayed. It wasn't his policy of confrontation that ended the Cold War. It was his policy of working with Gorbachev to end the Cold War.
And maybe to kind of follow up on that point, because I think it's very important, and you highlight it in the book. You mentioned the book, Reagan didn't go to church very often while he was president or governor, but he had a very strong faith, especially his mom instilled in him a strong Christian faith. He would go to church regularly. Some of that's, the ideas of seeing things in terms of black and white, biblical ideas of Armageddon. But in terms of real Armageddon, can you talk about how, while he was president, the early years to the mid-years and later, beyond just feeling we have to be toe-to-toe and stronger and better than the Soviet Union, the power of the fear of actual nuclear Armageddon really starts to play into his mind, and is probably maybe one of the driving forces for why both himself and Gorbachev, who has similar concerns, are really able to negotiate.
Yeah, well, I would say that Reagan had two competing impulses towards the Soviet Union. And people who knew him well will tell you that he was not necessarily a systematic thinker. He tended to be drawn by images and by anecdotes and impressions. And on the one hand, he had the suffering of the people under communist rule, which was very real, and he would meet with dissidents and talk about dissidents. I mean, these are things that my own family experienced in the Soviet Union before immigrating. So that was something that was very uppermost in his mind, the horrible human rights abuses of these communist regimes. But he was also very concerned about the risk of nuclear Armageddon. And as president, he participated in war games where he saw what would happen if there were a nuclear war, and the devastation it would cause. And he watched the day after this 1983 movie on ABC about what would happen to Lawrence, Kansas in a nuclear war, and he was very depressed and fearful about that. And that was reinforced, by the way, after his shooting in 1981. And he thought that the reason he was saved by the Almighty was that he would, his mission would be to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. And so he very much wanted to bring peace, and in fact, people didn't realize this at the time because he was opposed to the nuclear freeze movement, but his beef with the nuclear freeze partly was the fact that it was one-sided. They wanted to freeze the US arsenal but not the Soviet one. But his other beef with the nuclear freeze movement was he thought it didn't go far enough, because he actually wanted to abolish nuclear weapons, and almost nobody knew that in the 1980s, and he was often caricatured as this rabid warmonger, but in fact his dream was to abolish nuclear weapons. And in 1987 at Reykjavik, he and Gorbachev actually came somewhat close to that goal, where they actually almost agreed, they basically agreed in principle that they would abolish all their nuclear arsenals within 10 years. The sticking point was that Reagan was also very devoted to missile defense, SDI, or Star Wars, it was often known, and Gorbachev wanted a moratorium on the development of Star Wars, and Reagan would not grant that, even though his own aides were telling him it probably wasn't a practical feasibility any time in the near future. But so they left Reykjavik in failure, but it was only a temporary setback. And the next year, Reykjavik was in '86, and the next year in '87, they actually signed the first treaty abolishing an entire class of nuclear weapons. And so that was really Reagan's dream come true.
I just want to two more questions, and then if any of you have questions, my colleagues have those question cards. We'll get to those in a moment. We had Jim Baker here a good number of years ago, and someone asked, if Reagan was to see the Republican Party now, what would he think? He said he'd be shocked by it, and he probably couldn't get elected in it. But maybe what would be most surprising to him now is that it is the Democrats who are uniformly mostly behind, full support of Ukraine, of standing up and pushing back against Putin, whereas it's his own party that there are people like McConnell or Chairman McCall, good, strong advocates for standing up for democracy, even if it's flawed in Ukraine, not trusting Putin, needing to stay engaged in the world, not isolationism. But how do you explain that transition from a party that not that long ago, the idea of trust but verify, an actual Soviet, I think it's a Soviet saying, right, or a Russian saying, went from that to where we are today?
It is a long, strange road that we're on, and obviously there's huge differences between Reagan and Trump. And I mean, remember, as you were alluding to, Reagan was, pro-immigration, pro-free trade, pro-NATO, anti-Soviet expansionism. He had a very positive, optimistic vision of America as a shining city on a hill. He also was a great believer in civility in politics, and would never engage in invective against his political opponents. So, very far removed. But I think you can nevertheless situate both Reagan and Trump in the same kind of historical timeline of the evolution of the Republican Party. And I think this is really a trend that's been going on since 1964. I think that was really the turning point. When, remember, in 1964, most Republicans in Congress supported civil rights legislation, but the Republican nominee was Barry Goldwater, who did not support civil rights legislation. And that was the beginning of the hard right turn in the Republican Party, the purging of the Rockefeller Republicans. But I mean, there's just been a sorting out that's happened where basically all the conservatives wind up in the Republican Party, all the liberals wind up in the Democratic Party, whereas up until a few decades ago, both parties were much more varied in orientation. But because of the rightward drift of the Republican Party post-1964, what's happened is that basically every generation of Republicans is more right-wing than the previous generation. And so Reagan was more conservative than Ford and Nixon, and Trump, in turn, is way more conservative than, or more right-wing. I wouldn't even call him conservative necessarily, but right-wing populist than Reagan was. And I mean, you can nevertheless see that this has been happening over the course of decades, and each president, each leader has been moving the party a little bit further to the right. But a generation later, the party becomes unrecognizable, and the people who are kind of representing the previous generation are written off as rhinos, or not real Republicans anymore. I mean, the ultimate irony here is that when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. That was widely and correctly seen as a right turn, a turn to the right for the Republican Party and for the country. Today, if the Republican Party embraced Reaganism, it would be a move to the left. It would be a return to the center. That's what's happened over the last multiple decades.
A good question here. Sometimes people put their names, sometimes they don't. It's fine. You don't need to. It's covered a lot in the book. Obviously, you talk about Beirut and Lebanon, Iran-Contra affair. Someone asked what would be his view on the current conditions in the Middle East, and maybe in relation to that, how much should we realistically place upon Reagan and other presidents as well for kind of sowing a large degree of mistrust of the United States and our policies, especially the Iran-Contra affair. Kissinger said it as a flippant remark. It would be best if basically both sides could lose. We gave weapons to both sides. We gave intelligence information to sides, targeting information. We basically helped both sides kill each other more effectively. It can't be a surprise that most people in the United States, or in the Middle East, still don't have a good degree of trust in the United States. What's the legacy of Reagan in the Middle East?
Well, Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union worked out very well in the end, and in part because he was really focused on the Soviet Union and really studied communism for decades and tried to understand what was going on. But he really did not know much about what was going on in the Middle East, quite frankly. only visit to the entire region was, I think, was one short trip to Iran in the 1970s. So he was really at sea, and so the result was kind of one disaster after another, like the bombing of our embassy in the Marine barracks in Beirut, the kidnapping of Americans, and then of course the Iran-Contra affair, where we sold weapons to Tehran in return for hostages, and then, you know, Ollie North and John Poindexter funneled the proceeds to the Nicaraguan Contras. It was kind of one disaster after another, and a lot of the reason why, I think, was that Reagan really could not sort out the conflicting advice that he received. And when it came to the Middle East and most other aspects of foreign policy, the Secretary of State, George Shultz, and the Defense Secretary, Cap Weinberger, were at each other's throats. They agreed on almost nothing. And so Reagan could not sort out their disagreements, basically. And it was very interesting because there was an observation from Richard Pipes, who was a Harvard professor who worked on the NSC, very conservative guy, great admirer of Reagan, but his observation from NSC meetings was that, you know, Reagan didn't have enough knowledge to really sort out the advice that he was getting, and he also would not confront anybody. He would not force decisions. He would basically allow his aides to kind of do whatever they wanted. So after the Marine barracks bombing, for example, in 1983, Bud McFarlane, who was the national security advisor, and George Shultz thought that they had gotten Reagan to agree that we would bomb the Iranian facility in the Bekaa Valley where the attack on the Marine barracks had been planned. And we had very good intelligence as to where it was planned. But the bombing never happened. And then, you know, subsequently, Bud McFarlane and others said that Reagan gave the execute order to Cap Weinberger, and Weinberger refused to execute it. And he just refused to carry out the president's order. Well, I mean, I looked into this, and my conclusion was that's not really what happened. I don't think anybody's found this so-called execute order. I think what really happened was that Reagan kind of gave Shultz and Bud McFarlane the impression that he wanted to bomb the barracks, and then he gave Weinberger the impression that he didn't want to bomb the barracks, and so basically nothing happened. But he didn't actually force a decision, and so we had a policy that didn't make a lot of sense, and I think that certainly contributed to the morass in which we find ourselves in the Middle East today.
A good, interesting question here, especially kind of parallels with the 80s and modern day. Alex asks, Ukraine's President Zelensky also comes from an acting background, and he's also taken on a totalitarian regime out of Moscow. Do you find any interesting similarities between the two of them?
Well, I'm reminded of Reagan's quip near the end of his presidency where he was asked, you know, how could an actor be president? His reply was, how could anybody but an actor be president? And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I think Zelensky does understand the performative aspect of politics in a way that, for example, let's say Jimmy Carter never did, who certainly knew a lot more about government than Reagan, but he didn't really understand how to project and communicate a presidential image or how to influence people. And that's something that I think Zelensky is very good at. That is definitely a strength of his, is the, you know, I mean, he goes on TV every single night, gives a speech, and keeps his country together in the face of this terrible aggression, kind of much in the same way as FDR did with his fireside chats. And that was, in turn, something that inspired Dutch Reagan, listening to those fireside chats to emulate those communications methods when he became president and became known as the great communicator.
You've discussed some of it already, but maybe just to kind of further it, the explanation. Mark asks, how much did Nancy and her stepfather, Dr. Davis, a conservative Republican, influence Reagan's move to the right? And besides him, are there any other, in particular, individuals you think will kind of really guided him or kind of led him in that direction?
I think that's kind of a myth to suggest that Nancy or her father, Loyal Davis, her stepfather, really Loyal Davis, led Reagan to the right. I mean, again, I researched this pretty closely, talked to folks like Dick Davis, who was Loyal Davis's son, Nancy's stepbrother, passed away recently. But my conclusion, and there's no question that Loyal Davis, who was a surgeon in Chicago and Nancy's stepfather, was quite conservative. But I don't see much evidence that he really influenced Reagan. And certainly Nancy, from what I could tell in talking to her kids and others who knew her very well, obviously, Nancy didn't really have much in the way of political views. I mean, her view was she wanted her husband to be a success, and she was going to do whatever it took to make him a success. And Ronald Reagan had wanted to be a success by being the CEO of a major company, she would have pushed him to be the CEO of a major company. In his case, he wanted to be a political leader, and so she did what she could to help him be a successful political leader, but it wasn't, she didn't have any kind of agenda of her own. Ronald Reagan was her only real agenda. And so I think it was really the process that I described earlier of his work as the Screen Actors Guild, his work for G, all these things, those were things that led him to the right. It wasn't Nancy and Loyal Davis.
These are three somewhat related questions, so I might just combine them. Just in terms of, again, kind of where we are today, especially with his own party, the party of Reagan. Linda asks, is it possible for the Republican Party to return to the conservative ideology and pragmatism that Reagan represented? Brett asks, in a similar vein, do you see Reagan characteristics succeeding in politics today? And then, is there anybody today who reminds you of Reagan, and someone else, there's no name, says, who would Reagan support in this election?
Those are all hard questions to answer. I mean, the reality is, I suspect, even though Reagan would probably be horrified in many ways by Trump, he would probably support him just as Jim Baker has, because, he was first and foremost a Republican, and so he's going to vote for the Republican nominee. But that's just speculation, obviously. I have no way of knowing that. Is the Republican Party going to return to a more Reaganite direction again? Who the heck knows? I mean, anything is possible if Trump loses. I mean, I will say that I think both Trump and Reagan show in very different ways the power of personality in American politics, which in many ways is more important than ideology. It's having somebody who is a winning personality with charisma, who wins over people. And again, not entirely a coincidence that they were both hosts of nationally televised shows before becoming president. So maybe we should be looking at the ranks of TV hosts to see who's the next TV host who might lead the Republican Party. I mean, again, I think it's quite possible the Republican Party might go in an entirely different direction if there is somebody with that kind of charismatic, overpowering personality who might have much more moderate views, for example, than Mr. Trump. That person could in turn rise to the top. It's certainly not out of the question, but who that person would be, your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea.
When you're in the middle of a historic political shift or change, it's probably hard to know it or assess it or realize it. Right. Obviously, the Civil War and after Reconstruction, especially the core of the South, stayed one party really until basically the Civil Rights era, and then flipped again, sadly sometimes because of the issues of civil rights. When we look at our parties today, it might surprise Reagan that the party of the working class, even if people might be in unions, are perhaps voting for Republicans, and some of the business type people have kind of fallen in behind the Democrats. How do you explain that shift? Do you think it's transient, or I know it's hard to know, or do you think we've really kind of had a changing of the actual dynamics and ideologies of both parties?
Yeah, it's been a complete shift. I mean, among other things, I'm sure Reagan would be shocked to discover that California has become such a deeply blue state, right? Because it was actually a very Republican conservative state when he was governor and still president. So, yeah, there's massive shifts, and I mean, I think we can observe them and analyze them, but it's very hard to know, where they're going. But there has been real change in the composition of both parties and the ideology of both parties. I mean, it's not that unusual if you look at the long sweep of American history. I mean, Republicans and Democrats have been the two dominant parties in the United States since the 1860s, but in that time, the content of Republican and Democratic ideology has changed very, very substantially a number of different times. And this is kind of part of the pattern of U.S. history, where the labels stay that, I mean, it's almost kind of like, a football team where you have, the Texans or the Cowboys or something, and they all wear the same uniforms year after year. But the actual folks who are in those uniforms are very different. They may be running very different offensive schemes, whatever. The name stays the same, but the content changes a lot.
And just related to that, there are different upstarts and chances. You think of his Vice President Bush kind of loses because of a third-party contender, really the most notable one, then Nader too, influencing the election. But do you think the money required is too big, the political machine is too big to really have a viable third party in the United States anytime soon?
Yeah, I think it's very unlikely. We'd have to, I mean, this is probably above my pay grade, but I think you'd certainly have to change a lot of our political rules and regulations to make a third party viable. It really is not, and arguably you can argue we would be better off with more than two parties. But, so like in a lot of European countries, you would have like the center left and center right parties, and then you would have the farther left and farther right parties, and they'd have to make coalitions and do those other things, whereas here it's all subsumed under these two different labels of Republican and Democratic. But again, I mean, I have a lot of complaints and problems with the way that our political system works, but so much of it goes back to the Constitution or goes back to the way that laws and regulations have been written for decades. It's very hard to figure out how to rejigger that and to transform the outcome.
And just before the last kind of concluding question, again, just like to let y'all know next week, if you ever want to go to the Federal Reserve Bank and see what literally stacks and stacks of millions and millions and millions of dollars
and
looks
you can
like.
actually take souvenirs home with you. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah, you can. You get little shredded bags of cash, little connoisseurs of cash. We have an event on the energy transition with the president of Shell USA, Gretchen Watkins, and another great panel. 2 days later, we have an excellent event on Venezuela with the Venezuelan film director Diego Vincentini. His film, it's technically speaking, it is a movie, but it's highlighted upon real stories and real events of Venezuelan political prisoners. October 2nd, we have a great panel on recent political changes in Mexico and Venezuela. Mexico has its first ever female president, be inaugurated October 1st. Again, if any of you want to come here as Speaker Pelosi on October 9th, and then also someone you know very well, I have a very high regard for, October 24th, we're hosting former National Security Advisor and former Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. And we have other people all throughout those times. But just, I think a really nice way to finish this up. And I really, really enjoyed your book. It's a great snapshot. Max is an incredible researcher and an even better writer. It's very engaging. It reads like a story. I just felt like I was getting a view into the turn of the century, then the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, the 60s, all across American history, which is really fascinating. This involves the end of his presidency. Archie, like I said, another one of our great teachers from Lutheran South Academy. He says, how would you rate the farewell address to the nation in 1989? You discuss it in the book, and maybe is it emblematic of what he himself was about?
I mean, it was a very good farewell address in which he talked very modestly about his achievements and reflected back on what he had done and looked ahead a little bit. I mean, I actually talk in the book about the drafting of the farewell address, which was not easy. They actually brought in Peggy Noonan, who was no longer in the White House at that point, and she wanted something like much more reflective and personal than a normal presidential speech. And she was very, very frustrated because she got several meetings with President Reagan, and she felt like at the end of each of those meetings, she knew less about him than when she started. She could not get him to be self-reflective. And I would say, early in his career, Reagan was a crackerjack speechwriter, but by 1989, he was turning 78. He was slowing down. He was not really writing his own speeches. So it was a beautiful address, but I attribute most of that beauty of the speech to Peggy Noonan's skill as a writer. But ultimately, she was, like anybody else who tried to get to know Ronald Reagan, she ultimately came away kind of frustrated and kind of concluded that you couldn't really know him because he didn't want you to know him. And I think there's a profound insight in that. And so there was like this lingering, and you could argue perhaps that his very mysterious nature in some ways was actually kind of part of his appeal, because he could be many things to many different people.
Again, this is an excellent book. I've learned a lot myself. I really, really enjoyed it. I went through about 7 highlighters going through it. I invite you all to read it, especially if you consider yourself a Democrat, maybe you have a new take on Reagan, and if you're a Republican, a new take on Reagan. If you're independent and just really want to learn more about the United States and our history, it's an incredible book. And I'm going to volunteer Max to sign the books outside here. And I want to thank you all for forgoing the debate. This is probably
part of it. You can still get home.
And this is probably more civil, I hope. And also thank you for, I know a lot of people were scared off because of thinking about the rain and the hurricane and big bands of tropical rays coming through. But will you all please join me in thanking Max Booth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.